In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life from the desert, a legend was born. 4,300 years ago, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity to forge something the world had never seen before: the first multi-ethnic empire in human history. This is the story of the Akkadian Empire, a civilization that would set the template for every empire that followed, from Babylon to Rome, from Persia to the British Empire. For over a century and a half, the Akkadians ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, uniting dozens of city-states under a single crown. They created the first professional army, established the world's earliest postal system, and spread their language across the known world. Yet their story begins not in palaces or temples, but in a basket floating down the Euphrates River, the world before Sargon. To understand the magnitude of Sargon's achievement, we must first journey back to Mesopotamia in the 24th century BCE. This was a world of independent city-states: Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, each ruled by its own king, each worshipping its own patron deity, each jealously guarding its territory and trade routes. Mesopotamia was already ancient when Sargon was born. The Sumerians had invented writing over 1,000 years earlier. They had built the first cities, created the first law codes, and established the foundations of civilization itself. But Mesopotamia was fragmented, a patchwork of rival kingdoms locked in endless cycles of war and uneasy peace. The Sumerians dominated the south, their city-states rich from trade and agriculture. In the north, Semitic peoples, ancestors of the Akkadians, lived in smaller settlements, often serving as soldiers and labourers for their southern neighbours. The ethnic tension between Semitic and Sumerian peoples had simmered for generations, with neither group fully trusting the other. Into this world of division and conflict, a child was born who would change everything. But his origins were humble, perhaps even scandalous. According to the legend recorded centuries later, his mother was a priestess who could not acknowledge her son. She placed the infant in a basket sealed with bitumen and set it afloat on the Euphrates River, trusting the gods to determine his fate. The basket was found by Akki, a royal gardener who raised the boy as his own. The child was named Sargon, Sharukin in the Akkadian language, meaning the king is legitimate or righteous king. It was a name that would prove prophetic. As Sargon grew to manhood, he found himself in the service of Ur-Zababa, king of the Sumerian city-state of Kish. Here, working as a cupbearer, a position of trust that brought him close to power, Sargon learned the intricacies of court politics, military strategy, and the delicate balance of power that kept the Mesopotamian world in constant tension. But Sargon harboured greater ambitions. The young man who had floated down the river as an abandoned infant now dreamed of uniting all the lands between the rivers under his rule. It was an audacious dream, one that would require not just military genius, but a revolutionary vision of what a kingdom could be. The opportunity came around 2334 BCE. King Ur-Zababa had grown suspicious of his ambitious cupbearer, perhaps recognizing the threat that Sargon represented to the established order. According to later accounts, Ur-Zababa plotted against Sargon's life, but Sargon struck first, overthrowing his master and seizing control of Kish. This was more than a palace coup. This was the beginning of a revolution that would reshape the ancient world. Sargon understood something that the traditional Sumerian kings did not. In a world of competing city-states, ultimate victory would belong not to the strongest city, but to whoever could unite all cities under one crown. The rise of Sargon the Great. With Kish under his control, Sargon moved quickly to consolidate his power. But he faced a formidable challenge. Lugal-Zargasi, king of Umma, had recently conquered most of southern Mesopotamia and controlled a confederation of Sumerian city-states. He ruled from Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh, and commanded the loyalty of the most powerful armies in the region. The clash between Sargon and Lugal-Zagassi was more than a battle for territory. It was a collision between two different visions of power. Lugal-Zagassi represented the traditional Sumerian model, a confederation of city-states united under a supreme king, but each retaining its local customs and semi-independence. Sargon envisioned something entirely different, a unified empire with centralized administration and a single ruler. The decisive battle took place around 2331 BCE. Sargon's forces met Lugal-Zagassi's army in a confrontation that would determine the future of Mesopotamia. The details of the battle are lost to history, but the outcome was decisive. Sargon's forces routed the Sumerian army, and Lugal-Zagassi himself was captured. In a gesture that would become characteristic of his rule, Sargon showed both mercy and political genius. Rather than executing his defeated rival, he brought Lugal-Zagassi to the city of Nippur, the religious center of Mesopotamia, where he paraded him in a neckstock before the gates of the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. This public humiliation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Sargon's complete victory, while also showing respect for Sumerian religious traditions. With Lugal-Zagassi defeated, the Sumerian city-states fell like dominoes. Ur, the ancient commercial center; Lagash, seat of art and learning; Eridu, believed by the Sumerians to be the first city ever built, all submitted to Sargon's rule. But Sargon was not content with conquest alone. He understood that lasting empire required more than military victory. It demanded administrative genius. Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city he either founded or significantly expanded. The exact location of Akkad remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, but it was probably located on the Euphrates River, strategically positioned to control trade between north and south. From Akkad, Sargon created the world's first imperial administration. He appointed governors, called Ensi, to rule the conquered cities on his behalf. These governors were often locals who had submitted to his rule, ensuring continuity and reducing the risk of rebellion. But ultimate authority rested with Sargon himself, who held the title King of Akkad and Sumer, symbolically uniting the two major ethnic groups of Mesopotamia under his crown. Sargon's military innovations were equally revolutionary. Previous Mesopotamian armies had been largely militia forces called up from the citizenry when needed. Sargon created the world's first professional standing army, a force of disciplined soldiers whose sole occupation was warfare. These troops were equipped with composite bows, bronze weapons, and standardized tactics. Most importantly, they owed their loyalty not to any city or local lord, but to Sargon personally. The Akkadian military machine was built for rapid deployment and sustained campaigns. Unlike the city-state armies that fought brief wars and then returned to their farms and workshops, Sargon's forces could march for months, conquering distant territories and holding them against counterattack. But perhaps Sargon's greatest innovation was cultural. He proclaimed Akkadian, a Semitic language, as the official language of administration throughout his empire. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, a single language served as the medium of government across multiple ethnic and cultural groups. Akkadian would remain the diplomatic language of the Near East for over 1,000 years, long after the Akkadian Empire itself had fallen. The Great Conquests. With Mesopotamia secured, Sargon turned his attention to the wider world. His ambitions extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Sumerian civilization. He dreamed of an empire that would stretch from the rising to the setting sun, encompassing all the lands that touched the great trade routes of the ancient world. Sargon's first major expansion was eastward into the Zagros Mountains where the Elamites dwelt. Elam was an ancient civilization with its own writing system and sophisticated culture. The Elamites had long raided Mesopotamian cities, retreating to their mountain strongholds when faced with retaliation. Sargon changed this dynamic forever. His armies pursued the Elamites deep into their mountain territory, capturing their cities and forcing them to acknowledge Akkadian supremacy. This was warfare on a scale never before seen, sustained campaigns in difficult terrain, far from the familiar river valleys of Mesopotamia. The conquest of Elam demonstrated that Sargon's empire could project power across vast distances and diverse terrains. To the north, Sargon's forces pushed into Anatolia, the land we know today as Turkey. Here they encountered new challenges, different climates, unfamiliar enemies, and the logistical nightmare of maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles. Yet the Akkadian war machine proved adaptable. Local governors were installed in conquered territories, trade agreements secured vital supply routes, and Akkadian merchants followed in the wake of Akkadian soldiers. But it was Sargon's western campaigns that captured the imagination of later generations. According to the chronicles, Sargon marched his armies to the Cedar Forest, the Lebanon Mountains, and to the Silver Mountains, probably the Taurus Range in Anatolia. Most remarkably, he reached the Mediterranean Sea, which the Akkadians called the Upper Sea, or Western Sea. For a ruler from Mesopotamia, reaching the Mediterranean was an achievement comparable to Alexander the Great's march to India or the first European voyages to the Americas. The Mediterranean was a world apart from the river valleys of Mesopotamia, a realm of islands and coastal cities, of seafaring peoples and maritime trade networks. Sargon's inscriptions boast that he washed his weapons in the Mediterranean, a ritualistic claim of conquest. Whether this meant he personally led campaigns to the coast, or simply that his armies reached the sea under his command, the achievement was unprecedented. For the first time in history, a single ruler controlled territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The logistics of these conquests were staggering. Sargon's armies had to march across deserts and mountains, ford rivers, and besiege fortified cities. They had to adapt to different climates and terrains, face enemies with unfamiliar tactics and weapons, and maintain morale during campaigns that lasted months or even years. The Akkadian military machine rose to meet these challenges through a combination of professional discipline, technological innovation, and strategic flexibility. Sargon's soldiers were equipped with the finest bronze weapons and armour. They used composite bows that could penetrate enemy defences at long range. Most importantly, they were organised into units that could operate independently while remaining part of a coordinated strategy. Communication across the empire was maintained through a network of messengers and relay stations, the world's first organised postal system. Commands from Akkad could reach provincial governors within weeks, allowing for coordinated military and administrative responses to local challenges. Trade followed conquest. Akkadian merchants established trading posts throughout the empire, creating economic networks that bound distant provinces to the imperial centre. Goods flowed from all corners of the known world: silver from Anatolia, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman. Akkad became the hub of the first global economy. The cultural impact was equally profound. Akkadian art, literature, and religious practices spread throughout the conquered territories, creating a common imperial culture that transcended local traditions. Yet Sargon was careful not to completely suppress local customs. His empire was multicultural by design, incorporating local elites into the imperial administration and showing respect for regional religious traditions. This policy of cultural synthesis was perhaps Sargon's greatest achievement. Unlike later empires that imposed uniform cultural standards on their subjects, the Akkadian Empire created unity through diversity. It established patterns of imperial governance that would be emulated by every successful empire that followed. Centralized political authority combined with cultural flexibility, professional military forces supported by efficient administration, and economic integration that benefited both core and periphery. By the end of his reign, Sargon controlled an empire larger than any the world had ever seen. From the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the Zagros Mountains to the Taurus Range, his authority was acknowledged. He had created not just an empire, but a new model of human organization, one that would survive his dynasty and inspire imitators for millennia to come. The Imperial Administration Conquest was only the beginning. The true test of Sargon's genius lay not in his ability to win battles, but in his capacity to govern the vast territories he had conquered. How do you rule an empire that spans dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions? How do you maintain control over territories separated by weeks of travel? These were questions no ruler had ever faced before, and Sargon's solutions would influence imperial governance for thousands of years. The heart of Sargon's administrative system was the concept of centralized authority combined with local flexibility. At the apex stood the king himself, holding the revolutionary title King of the Four Quarters of the World, a claim to universal sovereignty that had never been made before. Below him was a carefully constructed hierarchy of officials, each with clearly defined responsibilities and authority. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an appointed official called an ensi. These governors were responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, and military recruitment within their territories. But they were not independent rulers. They served at the pleasure of the king and could be recalled or replaced at any time. This system prevented the rise of regional power bases that might challenge central authority. Communication was the lifeline of the empire. Sargon established the world's first organized postal system, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals along the major trade routes. Royal messengers carried sealed orders from Akkad to the furthest provinces, ensuring that the king's will could be transmitted across the empire within weeks rather than months. The postal system served multiple purposes beyond government communication. It facilitated trade by providing secure routes for merchants and their goods. It enabled the collection of intelligence about potential threats or rebellions. And it helped maintain the cultural unity of the empire by spreading Akkadian language and customs throughout the conquered territories. Language policy was another crucial element of Akkadian administration. While Sargon allowed local languages to continue in everyday use, Akkadian became the official language of government, law, and commerce throughout the empire. This created a common medium of communication for administrators, merchants, and diplomats across diverse cultural regions. The spread of Akkadian was facilitated by the establishment of scribal schools in major cities throughout the empire. These schools trained local elites in Akkadian writing and administrative techniques, creating a class of educated bureaucrats who could serve the imperial government while maintaining ties to their local communities. The curriculum included not just practical skills like accounting and correspondence, but also Akkadian literature and religious texts. Legal administration was another area of innovation. While local customs and laws continued to govern everyday disputes, major crimes and interregional conflicts fell under imperial jurisdiction. Akkadian legal officials travelled circuit routes, hearing cases and ensuring that imperial law was uniformly applied. This system provided a mechanism for appeal beyond local authorities while respecting regional legal traditions. The economic administration of the empire was perhaps its most sophisticated achievement. Sargon established a uniform system of weights and measures throughout the empire, facilitating trade and tax collection. Royal mints produced standardized silver ingots that served as currency in long-distance transactions. Agricultural production was carefully monitored and taxed, with surplus grain stored in royal warehouses for distribution during famines or military campaigns. Trade regulation was another crucial function. The empire maintained detailed records of merchants, their goods, and their destinations. Trade routes were patrolled by imperial forces to prevent banditry and ensure the safe passage of caravans. Commercial disputes were adjudicated by imperial officials according to standardized procedures. The tax system was both sophisticated and oppressive. Each province owed annual tribute to Akkad, calculated based on agricultural production, trade revenues, and population. In addition to regular taxes, the empire could impose special levies for military campaigns or public works projects. The burden was substantial, but it was offset by the benefits of imperial protection and access to empire-wide trade networks. Military administration was integrated with civil governance. Each province was required to provide troops for the imperial army when called upon. These provincial forces were commanded by imperial officers and served alongside the professional Akkadian military units. This system ensured that the empire could field massive armies when needed, while distributing the burden of military service across all subject territories. Religious policy represented a delicate balance between imperial unity and local autonomy. Sargon and his successors claimed divine sanction for their rule, proclaiming themselves beloved of the gods. But they were careful to honor local deities and religious traditions. Imperial temples were built in major cities, but they coexisted with traditional local shrines. Local priests were incorporated into the imperial religious hierarchy, creating bridges between central authority and regional traditions. The success of this administrative system was demonstrated by its longevity. Even after the Akkadian dynasty fell, later empires adopted similar structures. The Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and medieval Islamic caliphates all used variations of the Akkadian model. Centralized political authority, provincial administration, standardized communication systems, and cultural policies that balanced unity with diversity. But the system also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The enormous administrative apparatus required constant taxation to maintain. The professional military consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for productive investment. Regional governors, despite imperial oversight, gradually accumulated local power bases that would eventually challenge central authority. The very success of the empire created conditions that would ultimately lead to its fragmentation. Culture and society in the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire was not merely a political entity, it was a cultural revolution that transformed the ancient world. For the first time in human history, diverse peoples across a vast territory shared common institutions, languages, and cultural practices. The empire created a cosmopolitan civilization that blended Sumerian traditions with Semitic innovations, producing achievements in art, literature, and technology that would influence human culture for millennia. At the heart of Akkadian culture was the city of Akkad itself. Though its exact location remains unknown to archaeans, contemporary accounts describe it as a marvel of urban planning and architectural achievement. The city was said to contain magnificent palaces, towering temples, and broad avenues lined with the residences of nobles and merchants from across the empire. The palace complex at Akkad was the nerve center of the empire. Here, Sargon and his successors held court in halls decorated with elaborate reliefs depicting their military victories and divine favor. The throne room was a symphony of precious materials, walls inlaid with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, floors paved with marble from Anatolia, and furnishings crafted from cedar wood from Lebanon. These materials represented the wealth of the entire empire, brought together to create a setting worthy of the world's first emperor. Language and literature flourished under Akkadian patronage. While Sumerian remained the language of religion and high culture, Akkadian emerged as the medium of administration, diplomacy, and commerce. This linguistic shift had profound implications. For the first time, literature could be created that was accessible to peoples across the empire, not just the Sumerian educated elite. The most famous example of Akkadian literature is the Epic of Gilgamesh, though this masterpiece was actually a Sumerian creation that was adapted and expanded in Akkadian. The Akkadian version, however, became the standard throughout the ancient Near East, spreading the story of the legendary king of Uruk to audiences from Anatolia to Elam. The epic's themes, the quest for immortality, the nature of friendship, the relationship between humanity and the divine, resonated across cultural boundaries. Akkadian scribes also created new forms of historical writing. Royal inscriptions became more sophisticated and detailed, providing not just lists of conquests, but narratives of campaigns and administrative achievements. These texts established conventions of royal historiography that would influence historical writing for centuries. They also created the first examples of imperial propaganda, presenting the Akkadian kings as divinely chosen rulers, bringing peace and prosperity to the world. Religious innovation was another hallmark of Akkadian culture. While the empire maintained respect for local deities and traditions, it also promoted the worship of Akkadian gods throughout the conquered territories. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, became particularly prominent as a patron of the imperial dynasty. Her cult spread throughout the empire, often syncretized with local female deities. The Akkadians also developed new forms of royal ideology. Kings claimed divine protection and sometimes divine origin, but they stopped short of claiming actual divinity, a restraint that would be abandoned by later Near Eastern rulers. This ideology was expressed through elaborate rituals, monumental architecture, and artistic programs that emphasized the king's role as the god's chosen representative on earth. Art and architecture reached new heights during the Akkadian period. The famous Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, represents a revolutionary departure from earlier Mesopotamian art. Instead of the static, formal compositions typical of Sumerian art, the stele shows dynamic movement and realistic detail. Naram-Sin is depicted climbing a mountain, literally and figuratively, above his enemies, with the stars of the gods shining upon him. This artistic innovation reflected broader cultural changes. The Akkadian Empire was the first multicultural state in human history, and its art reflected this diversity. Sumerian artistic traditions were combined with Semitic motifs. Elamite techniques were incorporated into imperial workshops, and artistic styles from across the empire influenced each other in ways that had never been possible before. Technological innovation flourished under imperial patronage. The need to administer a vast empire spurred advances in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Akkadian mathematicians refined the Sumerian sexagesimal system, creating calculation methods that would be used throughout the ancient world. Astronomers in imperial service developed more accurate calendars and methods for predicting eclipses and other celestial events. Engineering achievements were equally impressive. The empire constructed extensive irrigation networks, building canals and dikes that increased agricultural productivity throughout Mesopotamia. Road networks were improved and expanded, facilitating both military movement and commercial traffic. Harbour facilities were constructed at key ports, supporting the empire's growing maritime trade. Social structure in the Akkadian Empire was complex and hierarchical, but also more fluid than in earlier city-state societies. At the top stood the royal family and the imperial nobility, many of whom were descendants of local rulers who had submitted to Akkadian authority. Below them were the professional classes, administrators, military officers, priests, and merchants. The middle ranks included skilled artisans, scribes, and small traders. At the bottom were farmers, labourers, and slaves. What made Akkadian society distinctive was its mobility. The empire's vast scale and diverse economy created opportunities for advancement that had not existed in the closed societies of individual city-states. A capable administrator could rise from provincial obscurity to high imperial office. Successful merchants could accumulate wealth and influence that transcended their origins. Military service offered a path to social advancement for ambitious young men from all backgrounds. Women in Akkadian society enjoyed greater opportunities than in many later civilizations. Imperial administration required educated personnel, and women from elite families were often trained as scribes and administrators. The cult of Ishtar, with its emphasis on female divine power, provided religious sanction for women's participation in public life. Royal women, including Sargon's daughter Enheduanna, held high religious offices and wielded considerable political influence. The empire's cultural achievements were not limited to the elite. Trade networks and communication systems spread technological innovations throughout the empire. Improved agricultural techniques increased food production. Medical knowledge advanced through the exchange of ideas between different cultural traditions. Educational opportunities expanded as scribal schools were established in provincial cities. Yet this cultural flowering contained tensions that would ultimately contribute to the empire's decline. The synthesis of different cultural traditions, while creating unprecedented richness, also generated conflicts between traditional practices and imperial innovations. The spread of Akkadian language and customs sometimes clashed with local identities. The concentration of wealth and power in imperial hands created resentments that regional leaders would eventually exploit. The successors of Sargon. When Sargon the Great died around 2279 BCE, after ruling for 55 years, he left behind the world's first empire and a legacy that would shape human civilization for millennia. But he also left behind a fundamental question that would challenge every empire that followed. How does one transfer absolute power from one ruler to another without destroying the state itself? Sargon's immediate successor was his son Rimush, who faced the classic problem of the heir to a great conqueror. The empire that Sargon had forged through personal charisma and military genius now had to survive under a ruler who had inherited power rather than seized it. The transition was violent and uncertain, setting patterns that would plague imperial succession throughout history. Rimush's reign began with widespread rebellions. The Sumerian cities, which had chafed under Akkadian rule throughout Sargon's reign, saw the succession as an opportunity to reassert their independence. Ur, Ummah, Adab, and Lagash rose in coordinated revolt, forcing the new king to fight for his inheritance. The rebellions were not merely political, they were cultural and ethnic conflicts that reflected deep tensions within the empire. The young king proved himself worthy of his father's legacy. Rimush's forces systematically crushed the rebellions, showing both military skill and ruthless determination. His inscriptions record the details with brutal precision. I defeated Ur and Lagash as far as the sea. I washed my weapons in the sea. I made heaps of corpses. The numbers are staggering. According to royal records, over 17,000 enemy soldiers were killed in the suppression of the Sumerian revolt. But Rimush understood that military victory alone was insufficient. Like his father, he combined conquest with political innovation. Rather than simply restoring the status quo, he implemented administrative reforms designed to prevent future rebellions. Sumerian cities were placed under direct Akkadian administration, with governors appointed from the imperial capital rather than chosen from local elites. Tribute requirements were increased, and hostages were taken from prominent families to ensure loyalty. The eastern provinces also tested the new king's authority. Elam and the territories in the Zagros Mountains attempted to break free from Akkadian control, calculating that the succession crisis provided an opportunity for independence. Once again, Rimush proved equal to the challenge. His forces pursued the rebels deep into the mountains, inflicting defeats that secured Akkadian control for another generation. Rimush ruled for only 9 years before meeting a violent end around 2270 BCE. Court sources suggest he was assassinated, possibly by his own nobles who feared his increasingly autocratic rule. His death marked the beginning of a pattern that would plague the Akkadian dynasty, the tension between royal authority and noble privilege that would ultimately destroy the empire from within. Rimush was succeeded by his brother Manishtushu, who faced similar challenges but proved less capable of meeting them. The new king spent much of his 15-year reign fighting rebellions and invasions, struggling to maintain the territories his father and brother had conquered. His inscriptions record campaigns in Elam, Anatolia, and along the Persian Gulf, but these appear to have been defensive operations rather than wars of expansion. Manishtushu's most significant achievement was administrative rather than military. He implemented legal reforms that codified imperial law and established standardized procedures for provincial administration. These innovations helped create the bureaucratic machinery that would allow the empire to survive the political turbulence of royal succession. However, like his brother, Manishtushu met a violent end, possibly assassinated by court conspirators around 2255 BCE. The succession crisis that followed Manishtushu's death nearly destroyed the empire. Multiple claimants emerged, each supported by different factions within the imperial elite. Civil war raged for several years before Manishtushu's son, Naram-Sin, managed to establish his authority. The young prince had to fight not only his rivals for the throne, but also the foreign enemies who saw the succession crisis as an opportunity for conquest. Naram-Sin's eventual triumph marked the beginning of the Akkadian Empire's golden age. Ruling for 36 years, 2254 to 2218 BCE, he proved to be the most capable ruler since his great-grandfather Sargon. But Naram-Sin's reign also marked a fundamental transformation in the nature of Akkadian kingship, one that would ultimately contribute to the empire's downfall. Unlike his predecessors, Naram-Sin claimed actual divinity. He adopted the title King of the Four Quarters, God of Akkad, and had himself depicted wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for deities. This deification was not merely ceremonial, it represented a fundamental change in the relationship between ruler and subject, transforming political authority into religious obligation. The deification of Naram-Sin reflected both the empire's strength and its internal contradictions. On one hand, divine kingship provided ideological justification for absolute rule over diverse populations with different cultural traditions. If the king was literally a god, then resistance to his authority was not merely treason, but blasphemy. On the other hand, the claim to divinity created expectations that no mortal ruler could fulfill and provided a theological explanation for imperial failures. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. His forces campaigned successfully in all directions, extending Akkadian control deep into Anatolia, far into the Zagros Mountains, and south into the Arabian Peninsula. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa, depicts the god-king trampling his enemies beneath his feet while climbing toward the symbols of divine favor. These military successes were supported by continued administrative innovation. Naram-Sin refined the provincial system, creating a more efficient hierarchy of officials and improving communication networks throughout the empire. Trade flourished under imperial protection, bringing unprecedented prosperity to the core territories. The capital at Akkad became a cosmopolitan centre that attracted merchants, artisans and scholars from across the known world. Yet the seeds of decline were already visible during Naram-Sin's reign. The cost of maintaining the vast empire strained even its considerable resources. Taxation became increasingly oppressive, generating resentment throughout the provinces. The professional military, while effective, consumed enormous resources that might otherwise have been invested in productive activities. Most critically, the empire had become dependent on continuous expansion to fund its operations, but geographical limits were beginning to constrain further conquests. Religious innovations also created unexpected problems. The deification of the king, while strengthening royal authority, also made the monarchy responsible for natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems. When these inevitably occurred, they were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure with the god-king's rule. This theological framework would prove devastating when the empire began to experience serious reversals. The reign of Naram-Sin's son, Shah-Kali-Shari, 2217 to 2193 BCE, marked the beginning of the end for the Akkadian Empire. The new king faced challenges that would have tested even Sargon himself. Climate change that disrupted agriculture throughout Mesopotamia, invasions by the mysterious Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, and internal rebellions that reflected the accumulated grievances of 2 centuries of imperial rule. The Great Collapse. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire was as dramatic and sudden as its rise had been. Within a single generation, the world's first empire, which had endured for over 180 years and controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, crumbled into fragments. The fall came not from a single catastrophic event, but from a perfect storm of environmental, political, and military crises that overwhelmed even the sophisticated administrative machinery that the Akkadians had created. The first signs of trouble appeared during the later years of Naram-Sin's reign, though their significance was not immediately apparent. Archaeological evidence reveals that around 2200 BCE, the entire Near East was struck by a severe drought that lasted for several decades. This was not a localized climate event, but part of a global pattern that affected civilizations from the Indus Valley to the eastern Mediterranean. The drought had devastating effects on Mesopotamian agriculture. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had supported dense populations for millennia began to fail as river levels dropped and soil became increasingly salinized. Agricultural production declined dramatically, forcing the empire to draw upon its strategic reserves. Cities that had flourished for centuries found themselves struggling to feed their populations. The climate crisis created a domino effect throughout the empire's economic and political systems. Reduced agricultural production meant decreased tax revenues at precisely the moment when the empire needed more resources to deal with the crisis. Starving populations became restless and rebellious, requiring expensive military interventions to maintain order. Trade networks that had linked the empire together began to break down as merchants found their routes increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Environmental stress was compounded by human conflict. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains who had been contained but never fully conquered by the Akkadians, saw the empire's weakness as an opportunity for expansion. These mountain warriors were well adapted to the harsh conditions that were crippling the lowland civilizations. They began raiding deep into Mesopotamian territory, targeting the irrigation infrastructure that was already under stress from the drought. The Gutian invasions were particularly devastating because they struck at the empire's economic foundation. Unlike earlier military threats that the Akkadians had faced, the Gutians were not interested in conquest and administration. They were raiders seeking plunder and slaves. They had no incentive to preserve the infrastructure they captured, and their attacks systematically destroyed the irrigation canals, storage facilities, and transportation networks that the empire depended upon. King Shah-Kali Shari struggled valiantly to hold the empire together. His inscriptions record desperate campaigns against the Gutians, Elamites, and Amorites, as well as efforts to suppress rebellions throughout the empire. But the challenges were simply too numerous and too severe for any single ruler to address effectively. Resources that might have been used to repair drought damage had to be diverted to military campaigns. Troops that might have suppressed rebellions were needed to fight foreign invaders. The administrative system that had been the empire's greatest strength became a liability during the crisis. The centralized structure that had enabled efficient governance during good times meant that local authorities lacked the flexibility to respond to rapidly changing conditions. Provincial governors, trained to implement orders from Akkad rather than make independent decisions, found themselves paralyzed when communication with the capital became unreliable. The empire's professional military, once its greatest asset, became increasingly unreliable as the crisis deepened. Soldiers who had not been paid regularly began deserting or switching sides to local strongmen who could offer immediate rewards. The ethnic tensions that had always simmered beneath the surface of the empire erupted into open conflict as Sumerian cities attempted to reassert their independence and Semitic populations fought to maintain their dominance. Perhaps most critically, the ideological foundations of the empire began to crumble. The deification of the monarchy, which had strengthened royal authority during successful times, now worked against imperial unity. If the king was truly divine, why was he unable to prevent the drought, stop the invasions, or restore prosperity? Religious explanations for the crisis suggested that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the Akkadian dynasty, providing theological justification for rebellion and resistance. The final blow came around 2193 BACE with the death of Shah-Kali Shari. His death triggered a succession crisis that the weakened empire could not survive. Multiple claimants emerged, each controlling different portions of the imperial territory. Civil war raged between rival factions while external enemies continued their devastating raids. The empire that had once controlled the ancient world fragmented into dozens of competing city-states and regional kingdoms. The Gutians, who had contributed so significantly to the empire's destruction, proved incapable of replacing it with a stable alternative. Their raids had been so destructive that much of Mesopotamia was left nearly uninhabitable. Archaeological evidence shows that many cities were abandoned entirely, their populations either killed, enslaved, or fled to more secure regions. The sophisticated urban civilization that had flourished under Akkadian protection largely collapsed. The destruction was not merely political and economic, it was cultural and psychological. The Akkadian Empire had created the world's first global culture, spreading its language, art, and institutions across vast territories. Its collapse shattered this cultural unity, leaving isolated populations to rebuild their civilizations from fragments of the imperial legacy. Yet even in destruction, the Akkadian Empire's influence proved enduring. The survivors of the collapse carried Akkadian language, law, and administrative techniques to new homes throughout the Near East. Future empire builders, from Hammurabi of Babylon to Cyrus of Persia to Alexander of Macedon, would study Akkadian precedents and adapt Akkadian innovations to their own circumstances. The collapse also generated a rich tradition of historical reflection. Later Mesopotamian texts, particularly the Sumerian king list and various Akkadian historical chronicles, attempted to explain why the world's first empire had fallen. These explanations typically blamed imperial hubris, the attempt of mortal kings to claim divine status, for bringing down the wrath of the gods. This interpretation would influence Near Eastern political thought for centuries, creating a tension between the practical requirements of imperial rule and religious constraints on royal authority. Modern historians have developed more complex explanations for the Akkadian collapse, recognizing the interaction of environmental, political, and social factors that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated ancient administration. The drought that struck the Near East around 2200 BCE has been identified in geological and archaeological records, confirming the ancient accounts of environmental crisis. The social tensions created by rapid imperial expansion and cultural integration have parallels in later imperial collapses throughout history. The Akkadian collapse was not unique. It was part of a broader pattern of civilizational crisis that affected the entire ancient world around 2200 BCE. The Indus Valley civilization declined dramatically during this same period. Egypt's Old Kingdom collapsed into civil war and fragmentation. Even distant civilizations in China and Europe show evidence of disruption during these centuries. The Akkadian Empire was perhaps the most spectacular victim of what scholars now recognize as one of history's first global crises: legacy and influence. Though the Akkadian Empire lasted only 180 years, a brief moment in the span of human history, its influence shaped civilization for millennia to come. Every empire that followed, from ancient Babylon to modern nation-states, inherited elements of the governmental, military and cultural innovations that Sargon and his successors pioneered. The Akkadian legacy is woven so deeply into the fabric of human civilization that we often take for granted institutions and practices that first emerged in the palaces and temples of ancient Mesopotamia. The most immediate heirs of Akkadian civilization were the Babylonians, who emerged from the chaos following the Gutian period to create a new empire in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi of Babylon, ruling around 1750 BCE, consciously modelled his kingdom on Akkadian precedents. His famous law code, while more comprehensive than any Akkadian legal text, followed administrative and judicial principles first established by Sargon's government. The Babylonian Empire adopted Akkadian as its official language, Akkadian administrative techniques, and even Akkadian artistic styles. More distant civilizations also absorbed Akkadian influences. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia used diplomatic correspondence written in Akkadian, acknowledging the language's status as the international medium of communication. Egyptian pharaohs maintained archives of Akkadian tablets, demonstrating the empire's continuing influence on Near Eastern diplomacy centuries after its political collapse. Even the Hebrew Bible preserves memories of the Akkadian period, with scholars identifying possible references to Sargon and his empire in various Old Testament passages. The Akkadian model of imperial governance proved remarkably durable. The Persian Empire, which at its height controlled territory from India to Greece, used administrative structures that directly descended from Akkadian innovations. The division of empire into provinces governed by appointed officials, the use of a common administrative language, the maintenance of professional military forces, and the balance between central authority and local autonomy. All these features of Persian government can be traced back to Akkadian precedents. Alexander the Great's conquests and the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed also drew upon Akkadian models. The idea of a universal empire uniting diverse peoples under a single ruler, the use of cultural synthesis to create imperial unity, and the deification of monarchs as a tool of political control all echoed Akkadian practices. When Alexander founded dozens of cities across his empire and populated them with Greek colonists, he was adapting a settlement strategy that the Akkadians had pioneered 2 millennia earlier. The Roman Empire, though geographically centered in the Mediterranean rather than Mesopotamia, inherited many Akkadian governmental innovations through intermediate civilizations. Roman provincial administration, Roman law, Roman military organization, and Roman imperial ideology all contained elements that could be traced back through Hellenistic and Persian precedents to their Akkadian origins. When Roman emperors claimed divine protection and erected monuments celebrating their victories, they were participating in traditions that Naram-Sin had established. The linguistic legacy of the Akkadian Empire was equally profound. Akkadian remained the diplomatic language of the Near East for over 1,000 years after the empire's political collapse, demonstrating the depth of its cultural penetration. Akkadian literary works, copied and recopied by scribes across the ancient world, preserved and transmitted the cultural achievements of Mesopotamian civilization. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, and countless other works survived because they had been written in Akkadian during the imperial period. Modern scholarship has revealed the extent to which Akkadian innovations influenced later developments in mathematics, astronomy, law, and technology. The sexagesimal system used in Akkadian mathematics survives today in our division of hours into minutes and seconds. Akkadian astronomical observations provided the foundation for later Babylonian astronomy, which in turn influenced Greek science. Akkadian legal concepts, transmitted through various intermediate stages, contributed to the development of Roman law and hence to modern legal systems. Perhaps most importantly, the Akkadian Empire established the template for imperial ideology that has influenced political thought throughout history. The idea that a single ruler could legitimately govern diverse peoples across vast territories, the notion that empire represented a higher form of political organization than the city-state or tribal confederation, the concept that imperial rule brought peace and prosperity to subject populations. All these ideas first achieved systematic expression during the Akkadian period. The Akkadian experience also demonstrated the limits and contradictions of imperial rule. The tension between central authority and local autonomy, the challenge of maintaining cultural unity while respecting regional differences, the difficulty of managing succession in absolute monarchies, and the tendency of empire to overextend itself geographically and economically. These problems, first encountered by Akkadian rulers, would plague every subsequent empire in history. The environmental dimension of the Akkadian collapse has particular relevance for modern civilization. The drought that contributed to the empire's fall around 2200 BCE was part of a global climate change event that affected civilizations worldwide. Modern climate science has confirmed the ancient accounts of environmental crisis, providing insights into how even sophisticated civilizations can be vulnerable to environmental challenges beyond their control. The Akkadian Empire's legacy extends beyond politics and administration into the realm of human imagination. The story of Sargon, the abandoned infant who rose to become the world's first emperor, became a template for heroic narratives that appears in cultures throughout the world. The biblical account of Moses, the Roman legend of Romulus, and countless other stories of foundling heroes who achieved greatness follow patterns established in Akkadian literature. In our modern world, as we grapple with globalization, cultural integration, and environmental challenges, the Akkadian experience offers both inspiration and warning. The empire's achievements in creating unity from diversity, its innovations in administration and communication, and its cultural synthesis demonstrate humanity's capacity for creating large-scale cooperation and shared identity. But its collapse reminds us of the fragility of complex civilizations and the need for flexibility and sustainability in human institutions. The Akkadian Empire stands as humanity's first great experiment in global governance, and in many ways, we are still living with the consequences of that experiment. Every time a modern nation projects power beyond its borders, establishes diplomatic relations with distant countries, or attempts to balance central authority with local autonomy, it draws upon lessons first learned in the palaces of Akkad. As we face our own challenges of climate change, resource scarcity, and cultural conflict, the Akkadian example reminds us that even the most powerful civilizations are mortal, but the ideas and innovations they create can outlive their political forms. The empire that Sargon built lasted only 180 years, but the world it created, a world of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and political ambition, remains our world today. 4,300 years ago, in the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a man named Sargon changed the course of human history. From humble origins as an abandoned infant, he rose to forge the world's first empire, creating institutions and precedents that continue to shape our world today. The Akkadian Empire lasted only 180 years, but its legacy is eternal. In every modern government, in every international organization, in every attempt to unite diverse peoples under common institutions, we see echoes of Sargon's revolutionary vision. The boy who floated down the river in a reed basket grew up to launch humanity on a journey toward global civilization, a journey we continue today. The empire fell, as all empires must, but the dream of human unity, the vision of peace through organization, the hope that diverse cultures can coexist under just governance, these ideals, first given form in ancient Akkad, remain as relevant today as they were 4 millennia ago. This has been the story of the Akkadian Empire, the dawn of our modern world.